In this video, we're going to take a look at Higgins Black, and let's jump straight to the end with what I think about this ink. It goes down much darker than it dries. After drying, it's more of a dark gray with shading, which I don't care for. Otherwise, it performs fine, and I've never experienced any issues with this ink. Now, I do know that what people are going to ask about, because I don't know that I've ever seen a review of this, is does it stain? And I have not had this ink stain a single one of my pens. So it's performed very well when it comes to that. It hasn't been overly aggressive on the paper, which is always a good thing. The biggest issue that I have is it doesn't perform well for me as a black ink. It simply is a dark gray. Now, if I approach thinking about it as a dark gray, then I think it's a very good ink. I think it's really stand out nice as a dark gray. It then would give shading that you would enjoy a great deal. So, for the sake of being sane, when I use it, I don't think I'm using black. I think I'm using dark gray. Although it still does make it a miss on this ink. It's not something I'm very happy with. Luckily, it is incredibly affordable to get a hold of a bottle, so I wasn't heartbroken. Spending $6 on a bottle of this ink to try it out didn't really hurt my feelings. Now, I don't know if everybody can manage to find it for that. I think I found it as a deal, and I don't know if maybe I got it as a deal because that particular bottle had been sitting around for a very, very long time. But that shouldn't have made it lighter as a black, because it was and still is in its box. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a TWSBI Eco with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here with the fine, we can see that it performs decent enough as a gray, horrible as a black. It is not giving a solid black line, it's giving a lot of shading. Now, it has no feathering and no spread, which is a very good thing. And it actually feels a little thick under the nib as a weird explanation. It makes a pen that has much more feedback feel like it has a little bit less. So in that, it's doing very well. The medium is darker than the extra fine, but only a little bit darker. It also has no feathering, no spread. It also is showing some shading, which, again, for a black, I don't like, but for a gray, it's doing pretty darn good. The stub, as a black, it's horrific. It has no feather, no spread. That's great, but it is absolutely a gray. So if I look at it as a gray in the stub, it's beautiful. As should be expected with this paper, we have no bleeding, no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Waterman graduate with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Pen BBS 456 with a 1.5 stub, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. While looking at the fine in the writing, it's darker and more complete than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's looking like a lighter gray or a lighter black than I would prefer, not quite just a gray, but kind of like a faded black. We have no feather and no spread. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It's still giving some shading, just as the fine did, just as it did on the Clairefontaine. But no feathering and spread, that's very good. And if I think of it as a dark gray, then it's quite acceptable. Now, the stub is a little bit lighter than the medium. It's about the same tone as that fine. It has no feathering, no spread. It shades, which is bad for black. I'm going to harp on that throughout. It is good for gray. Think of it as gray, and you will be much happier. As we have experienced before, we have no bleeding and very minor ghosting, a kind of ghosting you can probably live with. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine, it is much better than it has been on the Clairefontaine. It's not quite as good as it was on the Leuchtterm. We do see more shading here than we saw on the Leuchtterm. It has no feathering and no spread, so it's very good for that. This is now looking like a black that shades to gray. So if that is something that you like, this is doing very well with it. The medium is right about the same tone as the fine. It has no feathering, no spread. It still is offering that shading. So if you want that deep, dark, solid black, this is not it. But if you want a dark gray that shades to black, this is it. Now, the stub is by far the lightest tone on the page with no feathering, no spread, really shocking with this Moleskine notebook. No real shading coming through here, and that's more the paper where the way it's just absorbing in, we're not getting the shading, which I did find a bit odd with this being the stub. We do see some light ghosting, friendly ghosting, kind of like Casper. It's not being any kind of a real problem. If you wanted to use the back of the page, you can. And the absolute shocker, and I'm staying with this notebook for it, no bleed. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. On this paper, it doesn't ever look black. This is definitely a gray here, and I think a lot of it is the reaction with this particular paper. This is absolutely gray, where the other papers you said, yeah, that's gray. This, you don't think it's black at all. The fine gives us no feather, no spread, some light shading, which is not bad considering very economical paper, very economical ink, combined with a TWSBI Eco for students. Dream set right there. What a way to go. The medium is right about the same tone as the fine, has no feather, no spread, still gray, not black. No real problems though. It does shade, not good for black, good for gray. The stub is the lightest tone on the page. It has no feather and no spread. Light shading throughout, not tons, but definitely some shading coming through in each word. So if you're a student using a stub, you could use this, and your notes are going to look absolutely fantastic. In line with my experience with this paper, we have very light ghosting and no bleed. Awesome. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Onyx. Here is Lamy Black. Here is Pilot Namiki Black. Here is Waterman Intense Black. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. On the fine, this is probably the darkest version of this ink that I've seen. This, on this paper, looks black. This is good. This is a great combination. This ink for students with a fine or extra fine nib, they get black. They get no feather, no spread, no shade. Gorgeous. Absolutely awesome. The medium is the same tone as the fine because it is also black with no feather, no spread, no shading, looking awesome. This ink for this paper, winner, without a doubt. Now the stub, don't use a stub on it because you're going to start getting some gray, unless, of course, you do want gray. Now, looking at this, we are getting no feather, no spread. We are getting some shading, which if that's what you want, if you're okay with this gray, it's not too bad. If you wanted this to be black, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Use a finer medium nib, and on this paper, winner, winner, chicken dinner. To up the ante of how good this ink is on this paper, we have some ghosting, no bleeding. It never came through and touched the page underneath. We do get some spots that are a little deep into the page, but look at this. Great performance here. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diamine, their Umber. Here is a magenta ink by Robert Oster, their Australian Shiraz. Here is a pink ink by Private Reserve, their Shell Pink. Here is a turquoise ink by Robert Oster, their Aqua. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Following up that great performance on the Mead notebook paper, we get this 20-pound copy paper. Now, it is not as dark and solid a black in tone. However, it is a solid black. The fine spreads. It gets very minor feathering, the kind of feathering that realistically we can ignore, but it is there and tiny all over. On this paper, we can accept it. I think it goes out pretty well on the fine. On the medium, it's about the same tone as the fine. It has spread. It has minor feathering all over, especially if you see the word form or the word idealized, the word the word is. All of it has tiny feathers all over. Much more because it was a wetter pen. The stub is just a little bit lighter than the medium or the fine. It has feathering, it has spread, all of it manageable. You can still read it, so I don't want it to sound like it is the end of the world. I just don't know about going out of your way to actually use this. Now, the really good news is looking at the back or the next page, we have no bleeding through that touches the next page. We have a significant amount of bleeding into the paper, causing lots of ghosting. You could not use the back of the page, but you definitely could write on this paper without any major issues. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The best way I have found to get the darkest but not fully black line is from a wet gusher of a pen with a fine nib. Now, that's going to be on many of the papers, but that's when I have to bring your attention back to what we saw on the Mead notebook. That my pens aren't gushers. My fine and my medium, they're not gushers. They're just regular flow, and they gave good dark lines. So if you are a student using a Mead notebook, then a finer medium nib is going to do perfectly good for you. Now, if you're writing on other papers, then my real recommendation is go with a super wet fine nib. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.